Welcome everyone to Climate Ventures Conversations. Thank you so much for joining us. This is an event series that's hosted by the Center for Social Innovation's Climate Ventures. If you're meeting us for the first time, welcome. At CSI, we always start our events with an acknowledgement of the land, even when they're virtual. So today we want to acknowledge that for those of us who are in Toronto, we're gathering on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit First Nations. As we think and talk about social innovation, we are sometimes discussing a shared vision for a sustainable and just future. However, it's critical that we also reflect on the past and the present to consider how we can strive towards more inclusive, resilient communities that incorporate and respect many different ways of knowing and being. And as we move our work and our lives into the digital realm, this also means considering how patterns of inequality can transcend into these spaces. So on that note, I want to share this quote from Alexander Dirksen on decolonizing digital spaces. Meaningful change begins with recognition of technological innovation as a fundamentally human endeavor. Behind the sleek glass and metal enclosures of our lithium-charged lifelines are people, with each line of code carrying with it all the complexities of human existence. Technology is not a neutral force, nor are digital spaces safe spaces for all, instead mirroring, replicating, and at times exacerbating the real and pressing realities faced by Indigenous peoples and other marginalized communities in physical spaces. A social justice lens must therefore be applied to all that we discuss, design, and develop in the digital realm. So we encourage you to consider what it might look like in your work to apply a social justice lens, whether you're also hosting emergent conversations or if you're participating in them and shaping them. And we encourage you to check out this resource called Native Land so you can learn more about the land that you're on. And without further ado, I'm really delighted to introduce our guest for today, Cat Abreu. Catherine is an internationally recognized award-winning campaigner whose work centers on building powerful coalitions to advance transformative action on climate change. Is one of the world's 100 most influential people in climate policy, as named by Apolitical in 2019. She has over 15 years of experience campaigning on environmental issues, including 7 years in the heart of the global climate movement. Catherine is the Executive Director of Climate Action Network Canada, CANRAC, which is Canada's primary network of organizations working on climate change and energy issues. CANRAC is a coalition of more than 100 organizations operating from coast to coast. For 30 years, CANRAC has been the only national organization with a mandate to promote the interests of the Canadian climate movement as a whole, rather than any one individual organization. Catherine joined CANRAC Canada in July 2016, after 5 years leading the energy and climate programs at the Ecology Action Centre, which is Atlantic Canada's longest running environmental advocacy organization. She's also the former coordinator of the Atlantic Canada Sustainable Energy Coalition. Today, Catherine will be in conversation with Shea Sinnott, who is our Senior Programs Manager at CSI, where she manages climate ventures and earth tech. Before joining CSI, Shea worked for almost a decade as a program manager, organizer, and educator with a range of organizations fighting for social and environmental justice, including Code for Canada, the David Suzuki Foundation, Organize BC, and OpenMedia. Shea holds a master's in adult education and community development from the University of Toronto. So Shea, without further ado, I'll hand it over to you to get the conversation started.
Thank you, Zoya. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks, Zoya, for making my job a bit easier and introducing Cat. Hi, Cat, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. Where are you joining us from today?
I am calling in from unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territories in what is also known as Ottawa.
Welcome.
Thanks.
I am also
me.
speaking, yeah, of course. I'm speaking with you from Dishes One Spoon territory, also in Toronto, Toronto. And I guess to start, I wanted to acknowledge as well that I grew up on the West Coast on Coast Salish land. And so I'll admit, I said to Kat and my team that I've had a bit of a heavy heart this week thinking of people on the West Coast and the fires and the smoke. So I'm feeling especially motivated today for this conversation and really appreciate you being here and saying yes. So here we are. So yeah, Zoya, thank you for introducing Cat. I'm not going to repeat your very impressive bio, but I will say
Please
that in
don't.
terms of, yeah, please don't. Yeah, I don't know if you notice me blushing when people read stuff out about me too.
Yeah.
Thank you, Zoya. But in terms of flow for today, just wanted to note that I have a list of questions for Cat for sure, partly inspired by what I heard from all of you in registering for the event. Thank you for that. But I will pause at times throughout to hear from, to kind of pitch it to Zoya and Stefan to jump in with questions from you. We'll try our best to do that smoothly. Definitely want to hear from you as much as possible. And we will aim to end no later than 1:15, if not by 1. So that's our goal for today. We'll see how the conversation goes. So maybe Kat, to get us started, can you tell us more about your current role and your current work with CanRAC?
Sure. Climate Action Network Canada, we are an umbrella organization for groups in Canada who care about how a changing climate is affecting people, plants, and wildlife. We have now almost 120 member organizations across the country. Our membership is extremely diverse. So as you might expect, tons of environmental organizations of every size, from small community-based volunteer-led organizations to the big brand name environmental organizations that we sign petitions from regularly. But we also have a lot of labor unions, health groups, faith groups. I see that Michelle from Faith in the Common Good is on the line, who's a member of ours. International development and humanitarian groups, and of course, we have a lot of allies that we work with very closely, including Indigenous organizations and communities. So it's a rich place to work, and our work really centers on providing a space where groups that care about climate change can come together, discuss shared priorities, come up with collaborative strategies, share resources and learnings, and where we can also come together to figure out, in those moments where it's really important for us to speak with one voice, we try to convene those conversations. And then two things that I always like to note about the work that we do is, one, we connect up to the international space quite a lot. So Climate Action Network Canada is the Canadian node of Climate Action Network International, which operates in about 120 countries worldwide.
Wow.
And has 1,300 members globally. And the other thing is, I am a white passing person of mixed ethnicity. And so something that I really prioritize in my personal work, and that I think the whole team at CanRAC really brings to the table, is a priority of doing our best to help the Canadian climate movement look more like the communities that it works with and in.
Thanks for that opening. I'd love to come back to that conversation around justice, especially. But first, I wanted to hear a little bit more about you. I'm curious about your kind of personal journey to your current work. I actually just read an article this morning that you wrote a couple of years ago, talking about climate change work as an act of love. It kind of gives an idea of how you conceive of your work, maybe. So yeah, wondering how you got here. Are there some like big milestones or choice points that kind of led you to where you are now? It'd be great to hear.
Thanks for that question. That kind of personal reflection is always really important, and something that I think we sometimes lose in this work, because we're also like committed to making a difference, and we're so driven by the urgency of the climate crisis. And we sometimes forget that we're like humans doing this work with other humans. And it's emotionally exhausting work. So getting in touch with each other as people can be really healing. And that's kind of where I come at this from. I love people. when I was first starting my work as a professional environmentalist, I would often go into rooms where there'd be icebreakers, where people would go around the table and talk about why they became an environmentalist. And more often than not, people would have these beautiful stories of like growing up in some place where they were able to really engage with nature and just like valuing that space so much, and being driven to protect this natural ecosystem that had like so defined their experience as children. And I didn't really have that experience. I grew up in a high-rise apartment building on the side of a highway in a suburb of Toronto, pretty poor. I didn't see a live raccoon even until I was 19. So I didn't have that same connection to specific wild places, although I have, since had the opportunity to do a lot of that exploration. And I love, the non-human world, and I feel so much grief over the tyranny of the human species on other species on this planet. But I also really like people, and I think that we deserve a chance to keep thriving on this planet. And the climate crisis is pretty quickly diminishing our chances of continuing to thrive on this planet. And I think we can do better. I believe in the fundamental ingenuity and value of the human experience. And that's why I talk about climate action as being an act of love, because we often see it as like a fight with each other or against foes. There are a lot of metaphors of like conflict and war that come up in climate work, and those can be valuable sometimes, but I also think that we can really benefit from getting in touch with the emotion of it. And at this point in human history, we all have people who we love, we all have communities who we love and want to protect, and taking action on climate change is necessary to love the people we love and care for them at this point.
Couldn't agree more. Was there a moment or a time when you kind of knew that you wanted to focus on climate or environmental work, or?
Yeah, I'm like a born organizer. Like I organized my third grade class into a letter writing campaign against the Mike Harris government and their cuts to education. So it was pretty clear, like from a young age, that I was going to be an activist. And like you, really started in the social justice space. So, from a young age was organizing around food security in particular in Toronto. And then at some point in university, I got quite sick halfway through university. I was specializing in anthropology. I took a year off of schooling to recover. And when I came back, I had this like moment of clarity where I realized that maybe I was interested in working on policy. And so I picked up, in addition to my anthropology work, a degree in environmental policy. And so that was like my third year. I went into my first environmental policy class, and I met my first climate mentor, who is an amazing chemist named Miriam Diamond at the University of Toronto. And she gave me my first class on climate change. And it really changed my life. There was a while there as I was completing university where it felt like I was going to be a primatologist. Like I was really dedicated to that anthropology stream. And I spent my last year of university hanging out with the gorilla family at the Toronto Zoo, which was really amazing.
Oh, cool.
But I realized that I kind of couldn't spend the rest of my life studying the ways in which humans are just destroying the planet for other primates. And so the joke is that I instead chose to spend my life studying the ways in which humans are destroying the planet for themselves. It's a little dark, but
a little dark.
We gotta make light of things sometimes.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, cool. Thanks for sharing. You began to touch on it, I think, based on my understanding of it, but I wanted to do a bit of level setting. We use the term climate justice a lot. And so I'm wondering if you could define that for the group, or what it means for you, maybe what that means in practice as well, so we're all kind of on the same page.
Sure.
It's a big question, but
yeah. I mean, so fundamentally, my approach to acting on climate change is led by a climate justice approach. And I would say the same is true for Climate Action Network Canada, our organization. And what we mean by that is climate change is really the result of a series of injustices and inequities built into the economic and social systems that we inhabit. it is both a result of those injustices and inequities, and it also worsens those injustices and inequities. And that same system, those same economic and social systems that are causing climate change are causing a whole host of other destructive experiences in the world. So those same forces are causing the growing gap between rich and poor, are what underlie patriarchy and misogyny, white supremacy, and racism, and also operate with the colonial processes of extractivism, of cultural extractivism that we are particularly exposed to here in North America. And so when I say I work on climate justice, what I mean is I think the fight, the attempt to address all of those injustices and inequities are the same fight. Not that we work on human rights issues because it's a nice thing to do and because it strengthens our work on climate change, but because they are one and the same. And if we are going to solve the climate crisis, we need to fundamentally change the systems that are causing these injustices. So that is my take on climate justice. But I think the other important thing to note about that definition is that it's a very personal one, and it can also be a very local one. And I have seen and been a part of some amazing experiences of organizations coming together to define for themselves what climate justice means to them. And that can be a really powerful process.
Yeah, great point. And to build on that, and that was the connection I was trying to make, that centering of people to a shift I've noticed since at least, I don't know, I began in the environmental scene, is a centering of people and an attention to people as opposed to, for example, polar bears. And that's been, in my opinion, like kind of wonderful to see, because I think it's also much more engaging for a broader base of people too. They see themselves reflected in it. But shifting a little bit to think about the work, in promoting the event and talking about you, we talked a lot about your expertise in coalition building. I know that that's like a focus for CanREC's work. So I'm wondering if you could say more about like what that means, maybe an example, advice or learnings that you would share in that work. And I say that in part because it's not simple work, it's really important work. And frankly, I've often heard people like moan and groan over the years about like how difficult it is to get people to come together and work together. So the fact that you represent like such an impressive list of organizations, 120 as you noted. Yeah, I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that work and yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I'm an only child. And I was a classic overachiever in school, and I hated group work when I was younger. And I always felt like I'm just going to go off on my own. It'll be quicker for me to do it by myself, and it'll be better quality because no one's going to be in here messing up my thing. And then very quickly, when I got out of school and entered into my career, I realized that when I did things alone, while maybe I was producing papers or, engaging in certain policy development processes in Nova Scotia in a really effective way, I wasn't really making big changes happen. And it wasn't until I started working in coalitions that I was able to be a part of big change making. And it really turned my life around. I have a lot of appreciation for the model of the Ecology Action Center, which was the place where I started my career. They're a community organization that is so good at prioritizing that kind of coalition building. And I learned so much about how necessary it is to reach beyond yourself, to reach beyond the silos that you're usually kind of bunkered down in, and to figure out how to bring unlikely allies together, how to develop truly collaborative campaigns, and most importantly, how to solidify relationships of trust. Because ultimately, change, there's that saying, right? Change happens in two ways, very slowly and incrementally, or suddenly all at once. But the thing that people don't say about change is that it always happens, no matter the speed, because of relationships of trust. It happens because of people who trust one another, coming up with ideas and working together over time to spread those ideas, so that in those moments of disruption where change can suddenly happen all at once, the bedrock of the idea is there, and the relationships of trust to actually get it over the line are already formed. So that's become a core principle of my work. I love coalition building. It is like the center of the work that I do. And it is, of course, exactly what Climate Action Network is here to do. And I think, again, you know, just as because we in the climate movement are so driven by the urgency of the crisis, we can sometimes forget to be humans with each other in this work. We can also sometimes feel really exasperated in those moments where, you know, we know or we're being told that in order to get something done, we have to build a relationship with an organization or a community or an individual that we don't have a pre-existing relationship with. It can also sometimes be really frustrating for us when we're trying to build that relationship and that person, that community, that organization doesn't work in the same way we do, doesn't move at the same speed we do. Climate activists are always moving at the speed of light. There's never, you know, we always had to do it yesterday. And a piece of wisdom that one of my pals in this work, and someone I look up to so much, Ariel Deranger of Indigenous Climate Action, has shared that I like to repeat is, we really need to get better in this movement at moving at the speed of trust. Because that is what it takes to build these long-term relationships that are ultimately going to be what makes big change happen.
Yeah, hear, hear. Definitely some sound bites in there, Kat. Very well said. I wanted to build on that and ask you about kind of like what you've noticed in your years, like how has the movement evolved? But just noting that in a second, I'm going to pause and ask Soya if there are questions from the group as well. So my question, you're touching on it, but like zooming out a bit, kind of like what have you observed over the last 15 years, I think it is, that you've been in this work, like the kind of evolution, how have things changed or not? If you could comment on that.
Yeah, so I think your observation about climate work becoming much more people-centered is absolutely correct. A decade ago, when I started at the Ecology Action Center, I had to like ban all pictures of wind turbines, because that was like the only image that we ever used for climate action, was like a wind turbine, a solar panel. Images that had no people in them, right? Where people can see themselves in this huge change that we are so passionate about making in the world. And we've now come to this place over the course of that decade where, you know, I would say some of the campaigns that define the climate movement, at least globally, are, and here in North America, are campaigns like the Green New Deal, are campaigns like Keep It in the Ground, campaigns like the Just Recovery campaign that we've been really deeply involved with over the course of the pandemic. And those campaigns are all about people. They're all about figuring out how we can be transitioning to a climate safe society in a way that takes care of people and in a way that actually improves the lives of people. So not only, you know, keeps folks at the status quo, but actually addresses the kinds of injustices that people are experiencing where they live. So, and, you know, and gives people access to warmer homes, more availability of affordable housing, easier ways of getting around their communities, that seriously confronts the harmful, devastating legacy of colonialism and acknowledges the ongoing leadership of Indigenous communities and figures out how climate action can be a meaningful element of reconciliation, and giving back, or not giving back, because it's not ours to give, but prioritizing, centering the rights and sovereignty of Indigenous communities to live and prosper. So that has been really amazing and inspiring. It's complicated, and and it continues to challenge us, I think, to confront a lot of our internalized biases. And so, for instance, and maybe we can talk a little bit about this, like something that I think the climate and environmental movement has been really challenged on in the last few months is in confronting internalized racism. Like, the Canadian climate movement is very white, and we can, and I think because we are a bunch of progressives, we sometimes use this like progressive shield to say, like, we're not racist, we're not misogynist. Also, like, while the climate movement is predominantly led by women workers, the leadership of the climate movement in Canada is predominantly male. And we don't talk about that either. So these are challenges that are coming up for us as we move to be a more people-centered movement, but they are challenges that we absolutely need to confront if we are going to get to that system level change that we need to get to actually tackle the climate crisis.
Absolutely. And moving beyond statements and moving beyond like performative actions. The like racist underpinning and history of the environmental movement is shocking. Like the history of conservation and removing people from land in order to set up parks. And that we need to confront that. And then practically speaking, how do we implement that in our day-to-day? I know I said that I want to pause for questions, and I will, but you were on a roll. Can you speak to just recovery and that work? Because I think that touches on it. And specifically, like, I know that the principle, like it started before the murder of George Floyd and intensified attention on anti-racism work and Black Lives Matter, but also kind of what's happened in the last few months around that too. If you could share that with the group, that'd be awesome.
Sure thing. And I just noticed a question in the chat of who said that phrase, move at the speed of trust, and that was Ariel Deranger of Indigenous Climate Action.
I can share it after too.
Awesome, thanks. So the Just Recovery campaign is a campaign that we have been extremely invested in over the course of the last few months. Basically, as the pandemic hit, there were civil society organizations across the country who were scrambling to respond to the needs of their communities. All of us work in communities. Many of us, even if we are policy focused wonks in our day job, are activists at heart and are involved in really local community responses. So I think a lot of us were stretched thin trying to respond to those emergency needs in our community. But we were also thinking about the fact that this moment of disruption was opening a window where we had the potential to accelerate the kinds of changes that we have been working for in a really incremental way over the course of the last decade or two. And all over the place, I was watching incredible recommendations come out from civil society of every stripe. There were organizations putting forward recommendations on how to address income inequality, on how to address housing scarcity, on how to address food security, on how to address climate change, on how to build back better. And it was so inspiring, but it felt like we needed a space that could house all of that. We needed a container. And so a number of organizations came together, inspired by the international principles for a just recovery that had been released, worked on by 350.org in particular, but then signed on to by like hundreds of organizations globally. we had a conversation that we hosted, Climate Action Network Canada, in partnership with 350, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, and Lead Now. And those were the kind of core organizations who started this conversation that has since blossomed into a conversation that includes hundreds of organizations of every corner of Canadian civil society across the country. And together we developed 6 principles for a just recovery in Canada. These are high level principles. So when we started, we were like, oh, let's just like make a list of every single amazing policy that we need to put into place to build back better. And that just became an impossible task. And we also realized that, you know, the experts were doing that in their sectors. And what we wound up producing was this incredible platform that pulled these shared principles together that are now endorsed by 550 organizations across the country, and has since been used by emergent networks across the country to say, okay, like, we've signed on for a just recovery. Here's what a just recovery looks like when it comes to poverty in Canada and addressing poverty in Canada. Here's what a just recovery looks like when it comes to growing the clean technology industry in Canada. And that has been an incredible, like, once in a career experience, I would say, of building relationships across these silos that we're so often stuck in Canadian civil society movements.
And I'd imagine that that's speaking of moving at the speed of trust, and that, you know, that's the kind of bedrock that we might make the big changes from. Such a great platform and foundation.
And let me add, sorry, Shea, that the principles were released on May 25th, which was the day that George Floyd was killed. And the principles don't get everything perfect, right? They are iterative. They're a starting place for these relationships, as you said. And we hadn't explicitly named anti-Black racism in the principles. And so something that we were really pushed to do, like that we got to push internally from ourselves to do in the wake of George Floyd's murder, was to have a conversation about what Black Lives Matter and the movement meant for the just recovery principles. And that was also a really powerful series of conversations that we had.
Yeah, I tuned into that webinar, I think, that was held by the coalition. I learned a lot. Okay, now I actually want to pause and engage questions from the group. Zoya, can you hear me?
Yes,
is there a question that you and Stefan want to pose to Cat?
There are lots of great questions here, just to mention. There was a question. So we're going to, in some ways, view some of these questions together, because I think they do build on each other. So Kat, could you expand on the concept of moving at the speed of trust? And do you have any suggestions for action when our need to be allies might conflict with the need to reduce emissions as quickly as possible?
Hardball.
Let's jump it in there.
Totally. So for me, moving at the speed of trust entails like 2 core elements. The first is being willing to acknowledge harm. So we're climate activists, we're environmental activists, we're social justice activists. We have really good intentions. But another person who I take a lot of inspiration from, Adrienne Marie Brown, who is a facilitator in the US and has written a lot of beautiful books about movement building. Something that she says at the beginning of all of her meetings is we have to acknowledge intent and attend to impact. So even when we have good intentions, we can still have negative impacts. And the fact that we have good intentions does not mean that we negate those negative impacts. And the fact that we can sometimes have negative impacts doesn't mean we're bad people necessarily. It just means that we have to attend to those unintended consequences of our actions. And you pointed to a few unintended consequences of the actions of the environmental movement that have caused harm and that we need to be willing to acknowledge if we are going to build relationships with the communities that those actions have harmed. And so an example of that is, like previous iterations of the environmental movement that have, gone into places with great intentions of conserving certain parts of land and have, in doing so, erased the experience of Indigenous peoples living on that land. In more recent examples, and this kind of segues into the second pillar of like moving at the speed of trust that I work with, we can, in the climate movement, in Canada, now we're like, oh, we're good at talking to Indigenous communities. We like got that figured out now. But what we actually often do is we are really extractive in our communications with Indigenous communities. So we're like, hey, can you sign on to our petition? Hey, can you speak at our rally? Hey, can you come with me to this meeting with a government representative because you have legal rights and title that mean you have a certain kind of power that I don't have access to, and I'd like to access your power. And those can be really harmful moments as well. And so that kind of attending to impact and then realizing that when we're building these relationships, we need to be not doing it in that extractive way, but actually moving at the speed of what that other person who's in the relationship, that other community organization who's in the relationship needs to be moving at in order for the trust to be built is what I'm talking about. I noticed you unmute yourself, so when I can jump into the other part of the question, or you can say something.
I just wanted to plus one it.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't want to interrupt. Yeah.
Cool. And yeah, this question of how we balance the need to reduce emissions immediately with the need to build allyship. I'm going to be honest. In my experience, while I totally have empathy for the perceived conflict between those two objectives, in my experience, they aren't actually in conflict most of the time. Never once has my attempt to, push for a government in Canada to enact a piece of policy or legislation that's going to reduce emissions or stop a fossil fuel project that's going to increase emissions on the front lines. Never have my attempts to do any of those things actually been derailed by trying to build relationships with communities who I need to build relationships with in order to get that work done. And in fact, always has my attempts to implement those pieces of legislation and policy or stop that frontline piece of infrastructure, of fossil fuel infrastructure, has always been bolstered by that allyship and that relationship building. So I would maybe kind of challenge us to just do away with this myth, because I would be interested in hearing if others have examples of those things being in conflict, but it just has not been my experience.
And I think you touched on it too, talking about just recovery, and we're talking about centering of people. What if, imagine if in, for example, fighting for housing rights for all, which is a centering of people, we then also attain great emissions cuts and retrofit everywhere. And wow, look at that. We just were amazing allies to people that are houseless, as well as reducing it. So a flippant example, but that's what I've been learning a lot lately. And that's what I've noticed too, is some responses even from people in our community around the just recovery principles was wait, where's climate? Where's green? It's wait, but in fact, this is primarily organized by organizations focused on environmental rights. And yet it's a window in by working with and for people. So yeah. Is there a burning question, or I might move us along? I'm conscious of time. I want to talk about kind of our current moment if
I
that's
think,
okay.
yeah. I think I have a feeling that what you explore next might align well with some of these questions anyhow. So
Great. Okay, so I'll get us started and then flip it back to you.
great.
Okay, so I don't need to remind everyone, but because it's been a hard 6 months for many people, but it bears noting kind of like the immense amount of change that we've experienced. So quick list. So like we saw the price of oil plummet before the pandemic. And just this week, BP, British Petroleum, saying like effectively we've reached peak oil. Just like, wow, okay. Global pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, as we talked about, and like kind of like intensified attention on anti-racism and Black Lives Matter, our own government proroguing parliament amidst controversy, and then obviously intense fires on the West Coast. Like it's just a lot.
Our
I'm
finance
wondering,
minister just resigned in the midst of
oh yeah,
the
oh that
worst
too,
global
yeah.
financial crisis we've ever seen.
Yeah, like honestly, I didn't even, I was like, wait, what else do I, oh yeah, oh that too, oh yeah, that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been intense. I'm just wondering about your kind of like hot take on the kind of current state of the movement and climate action, and then specifically, Parliament's returning next week. We've got this throne speech on the 23rd. So much attention on it. Like, why so much attention on it? Why is this a defining moment? If you could speak about our current moment.
Yeah, for sure. I'll be kind of quick reflecting on the movement in this moment. The movement's been more passionate, has seen more engagement than I've ever experienced in my life. All of our members are saying we are having more engagement from the public than we've ever seen. And I think that is remarkable. And I think it just tells us so much about how people respond to crisis. I think there's like a myth that we divide and fight amongst ourselves. And in actuality, we come together to face the crisis as a community. And it's beautiful. So that's where the movement's at from my perspective. And hopefully like others are feeling the same way.
That's so great to hear. Yeah.
However, the maybe flip side of that is from a kind of governmental policy movement perspective, we have of course seen governments like necessarily, rightly, completely consumed with responding to the health emergency of COVID-19. And that has derailed all other policy priorities. Again, totally understandable. We have seen the total decimation of global economies. I mean, decimation isn't even the right word because it's just like such a complete, like it's like the rug was just pulled out from the global economy. And we've been so exposed to the vulnerabilities that were baked into economic systems, so exposed to the volatility and the vulnerability, especially of the oil and gas sector, and really, I think, confronted with how vulnerable Canada in particular is to the volatility in that sector. And it's been hard. People are suffering. People have died. People are struggling to pay rent. I mean, it is a really hard time. And I am someone who's been personally really privileged to be able to keep working during this time and to be financially secure. And my heart just like hurts for the amount of human suffering that we are seeing right now, not just from the pandemic, but from the ongoing escalation of climate impacts. It's hazy on my other home province is Nova Scotia, and my friends in Halifax are telling me that it's hazy on the east coast of Canada right now, which is wild.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we can see it in Toronto. People didn't believe me when yeah. It's just wild. Just wild.
It's totally wild. And in times of like such intense uncertainty, the status quo can be really appealing, right? It can be tempting to just be like, oh, let's just like try to go back to the way things were. But if this pandemic has taught us anything, it's how truly lethal the status quo is. The status quo is killing people and the planet. And so it's really our task. And I think we are rising to the task to really just encourage courage in our governments to say no to the status quo, to figure out how to do things dramatically differently so that we're actually protecting people, protecting the planet, building resilience, rather than doubling down on those vulnerabilities that have hurt us so much in the last 6 months. And that's why the speech from the throne is such a critical moment, because Trudeau has said we're proroguing government. We are coming back on September 23rd, and we're going to tell you what our plan is to build back the Canadian economy. And so all of us are sitting here asking, is your plan going to double down on the status quo that's killing us and the places that we live? Or are you going to imagine a whole different way of doing things in this country? And there are a lot of pieces that are involved in that. And as I've said, like hundreds, thousands, probably organizations across the country have just been like flooding government with ideas of how we can build back better. There's amazing work being done. I wish I could name it all, but I can't. It would be too much time. So the ideas are out there, and we're just kind of waiting to see, you know, where this government goes. When it comes to climate action, what we're really looking forward to is, you know, a kind of series of fundamental changes to the way Canada takes action on climate change. And one of them, I saw this a question in the chat, is a Climate Change Accountability Act. So that is a core campaign of Climate Action Network Canada. Something I say on that is, like, Canada's been setting climate targets since the early 1990s. We've missed every single target we've set. If you keep choosing the wrong partner, at some point you have to like look at yourself and ask whether there's something about you that needs to change. We keep choosing the wrong target in Canada. We have to figure out what needs to change about how we do action on climate change in this country. And legislation that makes institutional changes to hold this and future governments accountable for our climate commitments is a big part of that. But we also have other priorities, including just transition. So thinking through the clean energy transition in Canada, what that means for workers and communities, how we can be investing in the economy of the future that's going to be giving us lasting prosperity, that's going to be giving us those jobs that future Canadians can feel proud of.
Thank you for that. Yeah, there's just to plus one, like, there's no shortage of ideas. There's no shortage of recommendations. I think the question becomes, like, are we going to see leadership? I was so disappointed this week, of course, still keep up the fight for the addressing of the climate crisis, to see that there was like plans for announcing a big climate plan, and then rumors it's been shelved by the Liberal caucus for fear of appearing opportunistic. So just to note that, and that, like, it's incumbent on us to keep the pressure on. You don't need to hear that from me, but for the group. Maybe Zoya, I can turn to you. I would imagine there's questions that relate to kind of where we are now, throne speech, political moment.
Yeah, I mean, again, lots of good questions here.
You know, it's hard to curate, so thank you Zoya.
No, I'm delighted to be doing this. There was actually, so I know that you talked about a lot of big movements and moments that are happening right now, and there was a question related to like connecting like COVID and climate change and sustainability. So the question was from Jonathan around climate change and sustainability has taken a back seat to COVID-19 restrictions. For example, people using cars versus transit, plastic bags versus bringing your own. So the question for Cat was, how do you see this issue coming back to center stage?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because it's true that like disposability has become more and more prized in some areas because of COVID responses, and dealing with that's going to be an ongoing challenge. Like dealing with the fact that, like, you can't, you know, it's as simple as like Starbucks won't let you come in with your own mug anymore. And so you're kind of forced to, if you're going to Starbucks these days, use disposable cups again. So, you know, so there are these ways in which, like, some of the even relatively incremental gains that we feel we've made have been rolled back. And that's scary. I'm going to be real about that. That's scary. It does, of course, open up some important questions that we maybe weren't asking ourselves in the past. Like, you know, if we think about how our hospitals work, our hospitals have been so reliant on disposability for so long. Like, are there ways in which we can actually maybe bring back some of the processes that we were using in the past with non-disposable, like medical supplies and disinfection, like, you know, so there, I think that is a very live conversation. Of course, when it comes to the kinds of supply chain disruptions that we've seen through COVID-19, we've learned some pretty powerful lessons about the vulnerabilities of a globalized economy. And I think a lot of us are thinking about like how we can shrink those supply chains. It's really accelerated the conversation around like local economies, more livable communities. So that's, you know, perhaps one of the plus sides of it. When it comes to COVID-19 and climate, so number one, just as a resource, I want to share that the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment have a whole website on making the connection between COVID-19 and climate change that's like beautiful, and has specific talking points about it, how we can talk about those connections without being like really insensitive to the human suffering that COVID-19 is causing. So that's important. And then the other thing I'll say is, if this pandemic has made anything clear, it's the fact that our health and well-being is completely interdependent with the health and well-being of the non-human world. And I am really hopeful that people will hold on to that lesson. And that also people will hold on to the experience that we're all having as we're like locked into our homes, of how beautiful it is to get in touch with nature, of how like just like longing for our daily walks, of longing for, you know, those moments in the non-human world where we can take solace, where we can take healing. And lots of people are getting out and gardening, and, you know, like, I think that those are some really interesting elements of this experience that I'm hoping will lead to some really good change, and will perhaps give us an opportunity to have something to like talk to the public about on the heels of this crisis.
I could build on that too. I was asked a bit early on about like, are you disappointed to see that COVID has overshadowed, was a word that was used a lot, overshadowed the climate crisis. And I also wanted to echo the like feelings of hope, in that I think we've seen a couple things. Like, one is what our government looks like when they act like something, or what they do when they act like something is a crisis. Also, what it looks like for us to come together and try our best to take care of each other. And then, as you know, kind of this like collective moment, 6-month moment of pause and reflection, whether that means like us appreciating how important it is to come together with each other and that connection, or connection with nature. And so I remain hopeful, depending on the day, that we've learned a lot in the last 6 months. So just wanted to echo that.
Beautifully said.
Thanks. And then now I don't have to get in the way of other questions that are coming through. We're just almost at 1 o'clock.
Okay. Yeah.
And I do want to end with kind of like making sure that Cat can tell us if there are ways to support CanRAC and what we can do. But beyond that, we would love to hear other questions.
Yeah, I think, I mean, maybe we can end on this question, which is, there's a comment of, it's hard to feel optimistic right now. And Cat, how do you keep going when things feel tough?
This question challenges me. I'm going to be honest about that. I don't feel optimistic a lot of the time. I think, like a lot of activists, I am like fueled by relentless optimism in some ways, but I also feel despair a lot of time, and I feel grief. Like, I feel so much grief. And I think something that I turn to a lot is, you know, this Joan Baez quote, the antidote to despair isn't hope, it's action. And that's the fundamental kind of principle of my work. And I really fortify myself by taking inspiration from all of you. In this work, I get to work with so many incredible people who inspire me every day and who I know are just as committed to taking action as I am. And that really soothes my spirit. And I also go to therapy, just started therapy. So shout outs to like taking care of your mental health. And I'm trying to be more vulnerable and to just talk about these things more readily.
I joked with my boss this morning that I would try my best not to cry during this conversation. No promises. Yeah, just wanted to echo that it's hard, and speaking for myself in a position of privilege, and you know, still having a job, and I feel really blessed and grateful to be able to do this work. Yeah, just to echo the taking care of yourself and that it's difficult. So yeah, I heard you say that maybe that was our last question, or is there anything else that you wanted to add?
I think that feels like a good note to end on. Otherwise, there were a few questions about how people can get involved or how to get started in the climate justice movement. I have a feeling that that's what we can jump into now.
Okay, sounds good. I was also going to ask kind of like, what can we do specifically to support CanWAC's work, or any calls to action from you, Kat, in closing?
Great, thank you. Okay. I should have had links prepared.
That's okay. I'll send a follow-up email with links so you can pepper
okay, great
stuff. Yeah.
So climateactionnetwork.ca, you can donate to us. Donations are always very appreciated. We are not a volunteer organization. We're like a movement-facing organization. So don't try to volunteer with us, but do try to volunteer with our member organizations. Wherever you live in the country, there is an environmental organization near you that needs your help. So if you are feeling passionate about that, get in touch with those organizations and volunteer with them. If you're feeling passionate about starting your own organization, if you're like a person of color, for instance, who is seeing the whiteness of your local environmental organization and you don't really feel safe going into that space, then like maybe you can start a conversation in your own community about what your community's environmental priorities are, and start figuring out how to bring people together around those priorities. And maybe eventually you start your own organization. That the environmental movement runs on tenacity. So I just encourage you to like take what you care about and run with it. Right now we have calls to action around the speech from the throne. So we, along with about 100 member organizations and allies, penned a letter to the Prime Minister and to the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, outlining our expectations related to climate for the throne speech and the fall legislative agenda. That letter's on our website. It's been circulating on social media. Post it, share it, spread the word far and wide. And then maybe can I give you my spiel on like what you can do on an individual basis to help with the climate crisis? Okay, my spiel in order of priority. Number one, talk to your friends and loved ones and community members about climate change. The research tells us that the ways people get engaged in climate change is by hearing about climate change from people they know and trust. And we often don't talk about the issue. We sometimes feel like we can't talk about climate change because we're not an expert, or it's a touchy subject because we're not sure about someone's political orientation. Climate change is a nonpartisan issue. Please feel comfortable. If you care about climate change, open up the door for someone else to say they care about climate change. Number two, talk to your elected officials. You have to talk to them. If they are not hearing from their constituents that they care about climate change and expect their party, whatever that party might be, to take action on climate change, then they're not going to make that action happen. So we need to be talking to our elected officials about the issue. And then finally, on a personal level, if you can use energy less, do so. If you can use energy better, i.e. more efficiently, do so. But ultimately, the scale of the change that needs to happen is the system scale. So while it's important that we all do our part, the most important thing is that we're contributing to that systems level change.
Mic drop. That was awesome. Have you done this before?
Maybe.
Thank you so much, Kat.
Such a pleasure.
Yeah, I really appreciate you joining us. Also want to say thank you to Zoya and Stefan and my team at CSI and Climate Ventures. And thank you so much to all of you for tuning in today. Zoya, did I miss anything in closing, or are we good to wrap?
I think we're good to wrap.
Okay. Thanks again, everyone, and I hope you have a really wonderful day, and I will follow up with links and calls to action over Eventbrite.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, guys.
Have a good one.